Iran seems to be taking full advantage of the nuclear deal with the U.S., but how might it be affecting gas prices here at home? Foreign policy expert for Newsmax TV, Dr. WALID PHARES, is here with analysis. Cardinal Joseph Zen was arrested and released in China last week, but is due back in court May 24th. Will he again be detained? Editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Raymond Arroyo, weighs in. Is masculinity really toxic in today's culture? And what happens to society when manhood is in crisis? Anthony ESOLEN, professor and author of the new book, No Apologies, tells us why masculine strength still matters the world over. Begins right now.
Now, Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. What a show we have for you tonight. If you'd like to comment, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. Lots to cover this evening. Let's get started. The average gas price is above $4 in every state here in the United States. Who's to blame for the pain at the pump? President Biden is quick to point the finger at Putin and the conflict in Ukraine. But might the blame lie closer to home? Joining me for analysis on this and much more, national security and foreign policy expert for Newsmax TV, WALID PHARES. WALID, thanks for being here. Last week, the Biden administration canceled drilling sales in Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico at a time when gas prices are skyrocketing. The administration's trying quickly to find an alternative to Russian oil. And as you know, the U.S. reduced its reliance on foreign supplies, and it's pushing for green energy. Now, President Biden's attempts to lobby the UAE and Saudi Arabia to increase oil production produce nothing. Why are they so cold to Biden's overtures? They won't even take his call, WALID.
What a question, Raymond, and that would allow us and allow your viewers to understand that whatever our policy was for a year and a half under this administration, these are now the results coming back to haunt us. You mentioned Saudi Arabia, the UAE, I would add other countries in the region, meaning the Arab coalition or the members of the Abraham Accord. They were not happy over the past year and a half, at least, because of what? Because of the Iran deal. So in the Biden administration, rushes so fast to go back to an Iran deal that is going to threaten them. They were not included in the negotiation. So wasn't Israel as well. What do you expect them to do? So that's why we need to, first of all, make sure that we're not going back to the Iran deal, at least at this point in time, to coordinate with our allies on the ground, that's Israel and the Arab coalition and other forces in the Middle East. And at the same time, we need to get our energy here, at least part of it, so we could balance the loss of Russian oil and gas.
Yeah. Vice President Kamala Harris led a high-powered American delegation to the United Arab Emirates on Monday to pay respects to the Federation's late leader and meet the newly ascended president. Now, she was there, WALID, for a grand total of 3 hours. Did the VP's trip help repair the troubled, frayed relations with the UAE? And what should the administration be doing?
Look, I mean, relations between governments and nations are not done by 3 hours. The only 3 hours that changed policy in the Middle East was when President Sadat, the late President Sadat, traveled to Jerusalem and delivered a speech at the Knesset. He opened an era of peace between Israel and some of the Arab countries. The vice president going, that's a good thing. But before that, there need to be signals being sent by Washington, D.C. And as I said earlier, first of all, that we're not going to throw Israel and the Arab coalition under the bus because of the Iran deal, that we're not going to remove the Iran Revolutionary Guard, those who are actually firing missiles on the Arabian countries and Israel. We're not going to remove them from the terror list. But also, there is the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood. There's the issue of leaving Afghanistan to the Taliban. I mean, there need to be a change or a signal, at least. The president should deliver a speech and say, we are now reconsidering our previous policies. That would be as important, maybe more important, than the actual physical visit to the UAE or any other country in the Middle East.
You referenced the Iran nuclear deal, which is something Biden has been committed to since the Obama years. But the talks have stalled now because Iran is demanding that Washington lift the terrorist designation of the country's paramilitary Revolutionary Guard. The deal almost came to an agreement, but then Russia demanded that trading with Iran be exempted from the Western sanctions over the Ukraine war. You believe Iran is winning here. Why?
I do believe Iran is winning because Iran is in the center of a position whereby the administration is having to make choices. I mean, we cannot fight everybody at the same time. We are fully engaged in this issue of Ukraine. We are engaged also in containing China. North Korea is moving in all directions. So where do we send all our task forces and all our energy? In addition to the fact, Raymond, and we discussed it, you and I, Afghanistan is not right yet because Taliban are bringing back Al-Qaeda. So in this whole complex situation, to rush back and sign the Iran deal, I mean, let's take 1 year. Let's wait after the midterm elections. Because if we want energy from the Middle East, we cannot sign the deal and get that energy from the Middle East at this point in time.
Wow. At a press briefing this week, the State Department said this about the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that also known as the Iran nuclear deal. Listen.
At this point, a deal remains far from certain. Iran needs to decide, as I alluded to before, whether it insists on conditions that are extraneous to the JCPOA or whether it is ready, willing, and able to conclude the JCPOA, a mutual return to compliance with it, quickly. We know that it would serve America's national security interests. We believe that it in turn would serve all sides' interests.
Walid, would it serve all sides' interest if that Iran nuclear deal is signed?
You know, the problem is that the JCPOA that was designed in 2015, the circumstances have changed in the region. Iran is all over the Middle East. It controlled 4 Arab countries. There was no Ukraine war. We have a Ukraine war. Trying to remove the Iranian Revolutionary Guard from the terror list means that you're going to give them a lot of money. And it's going to allow Iran to buy more ICBMs, ballistic missiles. On top of it, just last week, as we can see it now on TV screens, there are a lot of demonstrations inside Iran. So this pressure group that is putting pressure on the Biden administration to go ahead and sign because of these contracts need to be patient. Because if we sign the agreement now, we may bring conditions that would be worse than any agreement that we're signing now in the next few years. Just patience should be the title.
Well, I also am concerned about the fragile peace that was negotiated with the Abrahamic Accords, where you have relative peace in the Middle East because you've got that bloc of Arab countries opposed to Iran. It keeps everybody in check and brings Israel into the family there. Now all of that is up for grabs again, it seems to me at least.
It is. I mean, just look at the slogans. The Abraham Accord is about peace between UAE, Bahrain, all the other Arab countries. It's bringing the Saudis soon. So if you want oil and the Saudis are coming in, that's where you should be going. While Iran is not, as the State Department official just said right now, is not accepting the conditions, is buying more weapons, is firing missiles against the UAE and Saudi Arabia. On top of that, is not even signing the minimum that the Biden administration wants. So if I am the Biden administration, I would dare giving an advice here. I would fully commit to the Abraham Accord, fully commit to the support of the Arab coalition, and then tell the Iranians, when you decide to come to my condition as America, then I'll discuss matters with you.
Yeah. In the meantime, we have alienated allies and now deepened our energy woes here in America because the Saudis could have helped us out by increasing oil production. They're sitting on their hands in the meantime. Moving on to the latest news from the Russian-Ukraine war. This week, Finland and Sweden applied to join NATO despite Turkey's objection. Jake Sullivan, White House National Security Advisor, said this.
This is a historic event, a watershed moment in European security. 2 nations with a long tradition of neutrality will be joining the world's most powerful defensive alliance, and they will bring with them strong capabilities and a proven track record as security partners.
The Finns leader is in the United States this week, meeting with congressional leaders as well as the president. How could Russia respond if Finland and Sweden join NATO?
Well, by extending their war in Ukraine, because what the international community wants, what the United States, European Union really want, is for Moscow to stop the operation and negotiations to start. So Russia or Putin could continue that confrontation, could extend it, probably not to Finland and Sweden, but to Moldavia, where one slice of that country is already under Russian militias or Russian troops. And also remember that Russia is an ally with China. If you look at Asia, Raymond, 2/3 of China, or 2/3 of Asia rather, have now got under a different axis, which is very hostile to the United States, and add Iran on top of that. So it's a good thing to have Finland and to have Sweden, and eventually later part of Ukraine to become part of the of NATO. But the timing is always the most important, and we need to be committed. We can't have them come in, and if Russia starts to pound them with pressure, just let them go. That's important.
Yeah. Well, it would seem to me if you let Finland and Sweden into NATO, then everybody's got to get involved in this war. And that doesn't mean just sending billions of dollars or weapons. It means sending our troops in. And that's a dangerous trade-off, I think. Putin's goal to invade Ukraine was allegedly to demilitarize, in his words, and to denazify Ukraine, as well as preventing Ukraine from joining the Western Defensive Alliance, NATO. Does Ukraine now have a chance to join NATO with Finland and Sweden on a fast track? And what happens to Ukraine?
Not immediately, Raymond, because that would be dangerous. That would be if Ukraine is now accepted as is during a war with Russia in NATO, and I know that Brussels and Washington understand that. It means Ukraine is at war, then NATO will have to, move on Article 5 and immediately join Ukraine against Russia. This is something that even this administration understood we can't do. What needs to be done is, first of all, ceasefire, let them negotiate on the Crimea, on the east, on the rest, maybe accept Ukraine as part of the European Union because that is economic. NATO would be too dangerous to have Ukraine going into that organization at this point in time immediately.
Ukrainian forces are on the counter-offensive to regain non-ethnic Russian territories currently in Russian hands. If fully successful, the Ukrainian army will reach the Russian red lines. The question is, what happens next, Walid?
I am very pragmatic because I'm a student of history. I wrote many books on history, as you know. Yes, Ukrainians can take back the areas where Russian troops are not going to fight to the end because this is not Russian land. That we understand. So all these counterattacks by the Ukrainians will get to Ukrainian ethnic areas and bring them back to Ukraine. Where I don't think this is going to be the case is when the Ukrainian troops get to ethnic Russian areas like the east or like the south, or of course the areas inhabited by Russians themselves. So at one point, what we're going to see is a ceasefire, a de facto situation between an eastern Ukraine controlled by Russia and the rest of Ukraine, which will be Western. And then the skills of negotiations need to show us how they can make this possible, peace possible.
Wow. The Senate voted this week a new $40 billion aid package for Ukraine. It could be on Biden's desk by the end of the week. Offering money to Ukraine is certainly better than military troop involvement. However, Americans are struggling with the highest inflation in 40 years, Walid. How should we be helping Ukraine? And isn't this just a big payout to military contractors who are trading out our old weapon systems and now leaving America with nothing, so you have to replenish the stockpile?
From an American national self-interest, it's really a question that American experts in finances and economics needs to answer, and the American public, citizens. I mean, how much money do we need to offer, not just in terms of Ukraine, who are fighting the Russians, but any other ally in the world. If we just are here to fund everybody who's fighting everybody else, we will have a financial problem here. We are committed to the Ukrainians, meaning we are committed into the defense of Ukraine. That I think we are doing, and Europeans should help us with. I don't know if we are committed to help the Ukrainian government go all the way to the borders and counterattack into Russia. So we have to strike a balance between the two. Defense, yes. offensive, they need to coordinate with us. Ukrainians need to coordinate with NATO and with the United States.
Good point. President Biden just left on an Asian tour. He's going to be there all throughout the weekend into next week. You believe that there's a Russia, China, North Korea axis forming. I want to put up a map. You tweeted this out recently. Theoretically, the new axis could create a defensive maritime front in the Western Pacific. What threats could emerge here, Walid?
Raymond, from reading the map, as simple as that, and I did it with a number of experts, that line starts in the North Pole. We are facing facing off with the Russians at the North Pole. And that now starts in Norway all the way down to Alaska. And that line goes down into North Korea. And then, of course, facing Japan all the way to subtropical Philippines and beyond. And let me remind our viewers that China, meanwhile, over the past 2 months, landed its forces, or at least its presence, in the Solomon Islands that is facing Australia. So I would be very cautious in terms of generalizing the confrontation across Asia. We are not ready. We cannot confront all these threats at the same time. I mean, China and Russia, North Korea, of course, and then you can't forget that Iran is also a problem in the Middle East. We need to be very smart, do priority, which is our priority right now, and then address it.
At a Senate hearing this month, Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines was asked if Beijing thinks it has a window of opportunity to invade Taiwan. Listen.
It's our view that they are working hard to effectively put themselves into a position in which their military is capable of taking Taiwan over our intervention, right? We can talk in closed sessions about timelines and so on for how quickly they think they may be able to achieve that.
What is the state of China's plan to invade Taiwan? Are they ready? Are they prepared to go?
Look, we have impressive intelligence community and agencies who collect a lot of information, listen to what all sides are saying, but the analysis at the end of the day is done by one brain at the very end. And so my assessment is that the Chinese right now, if we look at the whole capability of China, China today is not China of the 50s and the 60s, this Mao Zedong constant invasion. China is very capitalist. They have financial economic interests on all continents, including in the Americas and in Africa. So they understand if they want that flow of money, and by the way, they have our debts, by the way, they need not to shock us. So a pure invasion overnight of Taiwan, maybe the Chinese can pull it, but then they will lose all their economic might, and that's a big loss for their middle class. Rather, what I think the Chinese are doing, they're putting pressure on Taiwan, and at the same time, the stick and the carrot, and telling the Taiwanese, why don't you join us? But the real advance by China is not Taiwan at this point in time. It's the Pacific Ocean. I mean, they are buying elites in Solomon Islands and many other nations, and that would be the movement I would be very concerned about.
What's going on at the southern U.S. border is something getting very little attention. Texas is set to partner with the Mexican military in one of the Mexican states to jointly secure the border. Does this even matter, given that the administration's expected to lift Title 42, the health care turnback provision? We could have as many as 18,000 illegal immigrants a day coming across the border, Walid.
It is a race, Raymond, as you know, and you and I discussed it many times, between what the federal government or the administration is trying to open and what now local states, including Texas and others, are trying to address. 2016, at the end of 2016, early 2017, we discussed, you and I, that Mexico and the United States, it became the Trump administration, put together, the two federal governments, find a solution, and they did. The Mexicans deployed up to 27,000 troops, and it was moving forward in that direction. Plus, of course, you have the wall. Now, because Washington is not willing to take action, Texas is coordinating, or parts of Texas are coordinating with the other side, the Mexican local authority. And Mexicans and Americans on the Rio Grande can do much better than the federal sides on both Mexico and Washington. So maybe this could be a solution. I'm not sure about the other states, not sure about California, for example.
Yeah, Yeah, I'm also not sure about the federal statutes. I bet they're going to run afoul of federal statutes that protect the border and reserve that for federal oversight. They can protect inland, but not the border itself. So we'll see what happens there. WALID PHARES, thank you for being here. You can follow Dr. WALID PHARES at WALID PHARES on Twitter. 90-year-old Cardinal Joseph Zen, arrested by Chinese authorities and then released, is due back in court next week. What might be his fate, and where is the outrage from the Vatican? Plus, Pope Francis has more to say about the traditional Latin liturgy. Joining me on that and many other stories is editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal from Washington, D.C. Bob, I want to start with the case of retired Hong Kong Cardinal Joseph Zen. Regular viewers of the show will be very familiar with the Cardinal and the constant message of freedom, both of religion and human rights and democracy, that he has echoed over many years. He was arrested last week by Chinese authorities for, quote, colluding with foreign entities. He is due back in court on May 24th. That is a day, incidentally, set aside by Pope Benedict to pray for the church in China. Where is this leading, Bob? Where do you see it leading?
Well, it's an effort at intimidation. I mean, a 90-year-old cardinal, if you're terrified of that moral witness, it shows you that there's some power that is opposing something that feels itself to be inauthentic in a way. And look, this idea of this collaboration with foreign powers, this is as ridiculous as the Russia hoax during the Trump years. This was a human rights organization trying to promote democratic values and whatnot, which Hong Kong, at least in theory, professes to follow. So, look, this is clearly pressure from the mainland. It sends a message to a lot of different people who might be willing to step forward and follow Cardinal Zen's lead. We could wish that something would come out of the Vatican in support of him, but there seems to be just no will to do that.
The chair of the USCCB Committee on International Justice and Peace had this to say on May 11th in response to Zen's arrest. We'll put it up. The Vatican's press office said Wednesday, the Holy See has learned with concern the news of Cardinal Zen's arrest and is following the evolution of the situation with extreme attention. I join with the Holy See in expressing concern for the fate of Cardinal Zen and others who share his current predicament. I invite all those of goodwill to pray for their safety and that justice may prevail. That's Bishop David Malloy, who's chairman of that committee. Now, Bob, the Holy See and the USCCB statements really couldn't be more non-committal. Everybody's watching this situation with extreme attention. I don't know why they have to tell us they're watching it with extreme attention, but this seems to miss the point. Where is the prophetic outrage or condemnation? I mean, even Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi defended Zen as a critical voice of conscience and condemned China's failure to live up to the terms of the Hong Kong transfer. What should the Vatican and certainly the USCCB be saying?
Well, I think that religious bodies are in the business of truth-telling and of supporting moral values, moral virtues, if we want to put it that way. And this is not simply some sort of, border skirmish between two countries. This is a direct attack on, first of all, a major church figure, but also by proxy, a whole set of values that we in the West and the church in the world over the last several decades has championed as well. The church has been one of the great champions of democracy in Latin America and in Europe. But they seem to want to dance around this question of China. When China will not listen, it's clear that the Chinese are very hardcore. They see this sort of almost cringing approach to the issue, and they will not be moved, nor will they be stopped. It's important to recognize that it won't stop here unless someone puts some pressure on them to make them stop. And I think that is a primary function of the church at this moment about China.
Bob, it is remarkable that in the United States, we just sent another $40 billion to Ukraine in the name of protecting democracy, yet democracy is being taken and has been being taken day after day, week by week from the Chinese and the people of Hong Kong. and no one in the government issues any complaint, and now even the church is silent. Look, a day after that USCCB statement I read earlier, the Vatican Secretary of State had this to say to journalists regarding the Zen situation. He said, quote, "My most concrete hope is that initiatives like this cannot complicate the already complex and not simple path of dialogue between the Holy See and the Church in China." That's Cardinal Pietro Parolin. Bob, the secret Vatican-China deal just won't go away. As backdrop, it should be noted that 2 top Vatican diplomatic officials were withdrawn without replacement from Hong Kong and Taiwan earlier this year. There seems to be more concern at the Vatican over this still unknown political deal. The details are unknown. We know there's a deal. But they seem to be more concerned about that deal with the Chinese communist regime than they are about one of their own prelates, to say nothing of the Chinese faithful.
Yeah, you know, we keep referring to that agreement between the Vatican and China as a secret agreement. I mean, it certainly is something that we don't know even the barest outline of what it allows and it doesn't allow. There seem to be some rules, although we're not exactly clear on those, about the appointment of bishops. But look, this is a matter of a direct conflict between 2 different visions of the world. One in which a totalitarian state, a communist state, and we've had enough experience with these type of states now over the last 70 years, 70, 80 years. It's a direct clash between a communist vision of the world and a Christian view of the world in which human beings are free, they have dignity that has been given them by God, not by their governments. And it's precisely at these points that the voice of the church is extremely important in defending what can be still defended in Western values. To me, I'm just mystified by this. I've said this before on the show. I don't understand what the church or the West gained from this so-called secret agreement, but we see what the Chinese have gained, and they're taking advantage of it every way that they possibly can.
Well, Cardinal Zen, before he was arrested, on this show and elsewhere said this was a sellout of the Chinese church by agreeing to these terms. And he had seen some version of this and had been informed about some of the details of this agreement. But obviously, there were powers both in the Vatican and in the Chinese government that wanted him shut up and continue to want him shut up. Bob, I want to get your take on this. Just this week at his Wednesday audience, reflecting on the book of Job, Pope Francis said that protesting to God in the face of suffering and injustice is a form of prayer. God is not afraid of our prayer of protest, the Pope said. Now, Bob, if protest is prayer or can be, why not more protest when it comes to Cardinal Zen and the opposition of the Church in China by this regime? Even a determined global prayer initiative, we hear nothing.
Yeah, I think that was an unfortunate choice of terms. What he meant, obviously, was that, asking God why. And I mean, all of us do this at some point. A child gets sick or someone dies or there's a terrible circumstance. And, we protest, God, why are you, in a sense, we protest, God, why are you allowing this to happen? But it almost, by using that term, it almost gives you this kind of almost political sense of what he's trying to get at. And yes, if we're going to protest to God himself about things that we think are going wrong, I mean, these horrible regimes, such as we see in China, that have a track record of their own, and the ideology has a very, very dark track record. Look, in the 20th century, I did a whole book on the 20th century martyrs.
Yes, you did.
In the 20th century, China, communist regimes killed 100 million people. Probably 40 million of those were in China. So it's not hard to see where these regimes go, and you have to stand up to them. And the way that the church stands up is by its moral witness. It's not going to send in troops. It's not a question of how many divisions does the Pope have. It's a question of how human beings respond to moral principle, and they do. And if you help to strengthen the backbone of people who have to resist, whether it's in Hong Kong or whether it's in Taiwan or in our own West, then that is a role that the church can carry out that probably no other institution can.
Well, and we saw it, look, we've seen it in action in our own lifetimes with a man we knew, Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II. He summoned both the religious as well as the moral fiber of the people of Poland and destroyed the Russian regime without ever raising a gun or a cannon. It fell by moral suasion, backed by the deep tradition and the beliefs that he was on the right side of the angels. And you see that kind of rhetoric being employed vis-a-vis Ukraine, but nothing when it comes to the Chinese, because China remains a trading partner and somebody who, a market very important to American interests. The idea that they're going to lift tariffs on China, Bob, should fill every American with mortal dread. And the fact that both Republicans and Democrats are supporting that they should raise their voices and howl at their representatives. Bob, even the U.S. Congressional Executive Commission on China attributes the rise in religious persecution there to that Vatican-China deal. They say it's gotten worse. Why are we so unwilling to even speak about this or address the reality of what's happening there? And why is the Vatican silent on organ harvesting and enslavement of peoples for religious identity and illegal arrest of clergy?
I hate to say this, but this is a pattern that often has occurred in the church, where people feel that they've placed a bet on a certain path, and then they're reluctant to have to back off from it because it makes it look like somebody, it's not just mistakes were made in the abstract, but somebody made a decision that has led to a disaster. And I think that we're going to see this get much worse. The current occupant of the White House has got his own compromises when it comes to China, as we well know, also with regard to Ukraine. And the Holy See, under Pope Francis, has been very reluctant to call out regimes. I mean, we've seen this in the case of Russia as well. It's as clear as anybody could possibly want it to be that Russia has committed an aggression against another sovereign nation. And yet, for whatever reason, the Holy Father has been unwilling to specify that it is Russia that has taken these unjust steps in that war. So, look,
Bob, at least he's confronted Kirill and said, you're in danger of becoming Putin's altar boy here. And, I think he's been a heck of a lot more vocal about Ukraine than he has about his own suffering people in China, and now one of his cardinals.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's true. But even the engagement with Kirill, I don't see that there's much to be gained there. That, frankly, Kirill has long been compromised, as you and I know quite well, going back to KGB days. And why you treat him as a authentic dialogue partner on a religious plane, it just seems to me to not correspond to the truth of the situation. He's basically a member of the governing body of Russia. He is much less an independent religious person with whom he can enter into dialogue.
And Bob, just a note for our audience who may be tuning in for the first time, even longtime viewers, to give you an idea of what clergy are facing in China. Bishop Zhao Zhumin has been arrested 7 times over the last 2 years. Bishop Zhang, another prominent member of the underground church, that means the church in China loyal to the Pope and Rome, he's been missing. And now Cardinal Zen is arrested. What the Chinese have essentially done is decapitated the bishops and cardinals who were loyal to Rome, and they have replaced them with the Vatican's blessing, with nothing but party apparatchiks. And that's the reality. That's the reality. And Bob, as you're aware, Jimmy Lai was given an honorary degree recently at Catholic University. How important is it to honor and keep attention on the injustices being committed by China, particularly when Lai is still incarcerated?
Well, I think it's fundamentally important that we keep these people in our memories and in our prayers, because, look, this situation did not go away. What tends to happen, as we know, given the news cycle these days, is somebody's arrested, and a week later everybody says, oh yeah, we already know about that, and they forget about it. Meanwhile, someone may be sitting in prison, they may be tortured, they may be under psychological pressures. And this is typical of the type of regime you see in a place like China, and we can't let them get away with this. So I'm very proud of the Catholic University of America right here in Washington, D.C., for being brave enough to bring up that case again and remind people once again, and we need much more of this going on in all sorts of places in the free world, to remind people that in our world today, in our postmodern, we think liberated, woke world, there's a great deal of real repression, not the fantastic oppression people think that they're suffering in a place like the United States, but real oppression in a classic sense of people being thrown into jail, being intimidated, facing, who knows how many years in prison, disappearances. This is a very sad story that was played out all too often in the 20th century, and we shouldn't allow it to happen again in the 21st.
Bob, before we move on, Roe v. Wade very likely could be overturned over the next few weeks here in the United States, should the Supreme Court rule in that direction. It looks like that's where they're tending. What do you make of the relative silence from the Vatican on really one of the cornerstones of the faith, which is a commitment to life?
Well, if it's a relative silence, I would even be happy. I don't know that there's been a word spoken. Maybe there has been, and I just haven't seen about this case. And, you hear excuses that the people don't want to provoke an anti-Catholic backlash, and there is anti-Catholicism in the United States that would be exploited, of course. But look, the Vatican and other religious bodies, including our bishops, have no trouble at all speaking out in political terms about climate change, about refugees, and all sorts of other subjects, the poor. This is the unborn are the poorest of the poor and the most slaughtered category of people on the face of the earth today. Not to even mention that you hope that the Supreme Court will do the right thing in seeking to protect life at all stages. This just seems to me to have diminished the moral witness of the Church in ways that will have repercussions in the future. The other things, the refugees and the climate, et cetera, those are debatable policy questions. This is a fundamental respect for human life. And if you can't speak out about that, just as if you can't speak out about religious liberty when these questions come up, then what are you in business for?
I want to move on to Pope Francis's recent comments before we run out of time on the liturgy, the traditional Latin liturgy. It has become a favorite subject of the Holy Father. Here's what he said just last week. I still emphasize that liturgical life and the study of it must lead to greater ecclesial unity, not division. When liturgical life is a bit of a banner of division, there is the smell of the devil in there, the deceiver. It is not possible to worship God and at the same time make the liturgy a battlefield for questions that are not essential. Bob, the Pope seems to be convinced that the traditional Latin Mass and the community surrounding it cause division, tripling down on the assertions of his guardians of the tradition that encyclical he wrote. Your thoughts on all of this?
Yeah,
motu proprio, rather.
Yeah, I really find this inappropriate. I mean, I want to say that frankly, because look, even at their worst, and people do write me and call me and tell me about they've encountered somebody who disputes the validity of the current Mass, and I understand that there are people like that. Of course there are. But there are a tiny minority of the people who are interested in the traditional Latin Mass. And even when they are somewhat extreme, or if you want to put it this way, divisive, at least they're hearkening back to something that is truly Catholic. We see a lot of other movements in the contemporary world of real schism. I mean, we mentioned Germany in past shows, for example, and there doesn't seem to be any sense of urgency about these radical departures from all sorts of things that the Church has believed for 2,000 years. So I find him, I mean, it seems to me that there's a straw man here, and he's attacking not simply people who, with great reverence and feeling that it nourishes their spiritual life, want to continue with that traditional Latin form of the Mass. He's attacking people. He's saying that these people are divisive. I don't believe that by and large is true. And I have to say, because I don't think he's meeting with a lot of people who are divisive, I think people are feeding him that story, and it's a false story.
The Vatican's financial fraud trial continues in Rome this week, Bob. We've been watching this for years now. On Wednesday, Cardinal Angelo Becciu testified on Wednesday that it was Pope Francis who ordered the ousting of Auditor General Libero Milone. Now, as well as that cancellation of the Price Waterhouse internal audit. According to Beishu, I have no responsibility concerning the resignation of Dr. Milone. I merely followed an order received by the Holy Father that was taken in full autonomy without any involvement. Bob, originally it was Beishu who was accused of firing Milone, but the firing came after they discovered that Milone had hired a firm to spy on clerics who might be engaged in corruption. Now, I thought everybody wanted full transparency. Now we learn the Pope demanded that Milone be fired. Your take on this?
Well, you know, there are some people whose judgment I trust about this who say that this trial will never really resolve the problem. And I think that there's reason to believe that, but I'm hopeful that that's not the case. Look, I have to think, as with the question of the Latin Mass people, that somebody has to be advising the Pope about this. He's got many, many responsibilities. I doubt that he's going over, you know, real estate transactions and prices and exchanges and whatnot. Someone told him that Milone had to be fired because he was doing something outside of the bounds. It seems to me that if he began to investigate and thought he could not trust people within the Vatican to carry out an impartial investigation, he probably was onto something. I don't think that this was just some kind of fishing expedition on his part. I think he sincerely knew that something was out there. The problem with this is that we've had this assertion by Becciu. I don't think that the Holy Father can be called as a witness in a Vatican trial. No. I don't think that he can even publicly make a statement contradicting what Becciu has said. And we know that he stripped Becciu of his cardinal prerogatives because he had lost confidence in Becciu. So we've got this statement. It may be true, it may not be true. Ultimately, it probably is true that the Pope made that decision, but after what preliminaries that were probably guided by Becciu and others in the Vatican?
Well, this is similar to your commentary about the Latin Mass, the Pope's perspective on the Latin Mass and the community. He's being given this information by people, and in this case, you may have people who were involved in this probe and were targeted by the investigators. So it was in their interest to kill the investigation and certainly any outside probing eyes. And they successfully did that. Now, speaking of rule changes, very quickly, I want to get your thoughts on this. Jesuit Father Tom Rees wrote a column this week imploring Pope Francis to change the rules of papal elections to prevent a, quote, deadlocked conclave. According to Rees, innovations by John Paul II and Benedict XVI that intended to prevent a long conclave actually thwarted compromise among the cardinals. Rees' solution? To return to the traditional two-thirds vote of the cardinals to elect a pope. Bob, your thoughts on this? Does this suggestion have any merit?
I want to see the evidence. What deadlocked conclaves have we seen? The election of Benedict was relatively quick. The election of Francis was relatively quick. I mean, if we were talking in the history of the Church, I mean, there have been times when conclaves have gone on for weeks and months, and when the citizens of Rome have stormed the Vatican and told the cardinals elect somebody already. So that would be deadlock. I'm a little bit skeptical of the person proposing this and of the proposal. I think that it's worked reasonably well up until now, and until we see that there's a problem of some sort, I would stick with a tried and true. It gives you good popes and it gives you bad popes, but at least it's something that we have a certain confidence in. We don't know what a different approach might produce.
Well, Bob, I was delighted to see that Father Rees had discovered innovations that he didn't like in the Church, but I'll leave it there. For commentary, you can visit Robert Royal at thecatholicthing.org. Is there a crisis of masculinity in today's culture? My next guest believes so. In his new book, No Apologies, Why Civilization Depends on the Strength of Men, he draws on timeless wisdom to defend the traditionally masculine virtues. Please welcome Professor in Residence at Magdalen College in Warner, New Hampshire, Anthony ESOLEN. Thank you so much for being here, Anthony. We hear the term toxic masculinity tossed around a lot today. What's wrong with masculinity as we know it today? or the perception of it at least?
Well, all we'd have to do is to change that word masculinity to manliness, and immediately we see a contradiction, an absurdity in the phrase toxic manliness. Surely not, right? The problem is that with mass entertainment the way it is, giving boys especially no decent models of manliness, and so many boys growing up without fathers in the home at all, and in school not being fed with the great epic tales of true manhood. What you get is either a deficiency of masculinity or a caricature of it, a cartoon, a parody. So we end up with a terrible phrase to be throwing at boys all the time, toxic masculinity, when what we really ought to be doing is to be training these young boys in manliness, which is a very great and necessary virtue.
Why did you decide to write this book now? Was it something that you were perceiving in the culture or in the classroom?
Well, perhaps not in my classroom at Magdalen College, but yeah, I had seen it for many years in the college classroom at Providence College. Not always, not in all students, but a certain lassitude among the young men. I don't mean laziness exactly. I mean a kind of wistful hopelessness, a sense that they were not really needed, and that many of the things that they by nature preferred to do were somehow suspect. And I came along, and for many years I would tell them, no, it's not true. You're being fed a lie. But instead of swinging into a parody of masculinity, which is machismo, let's take a look at what societies all across the world have valued in men.
Yeah, you reference in the book Homer's Odyssey about Odysseus and his journey home from the Trojan War. What can Odysseus's character and journey teach us about true masculinity or manliness?
One of the things, that's a great question. One of the things, there's a lot to learn about Odysseus. He's a true man. He's not perfect. He's not a saint, not by a long stretch. However, he's to be distinguished on the one hand from the suitors who are making themselves obnoxious in the absence of the father of the city. That is to say, Odysseus as king of Ithaca has the role of a father. With the father absent, we don't get feminism. What we get are young men out of control. So you have 108 suitors eating up house and home in Odysseus' estate in Ithaca. Their own fathers in the city either unable to control them or unwilling. The poem ends with the reestablishment of the family, the household, and the city of Ithaca.
In your book, you write about the difficulty men have today navigating American society. This is a quote. In which place does a man now feel most comfortable speaking his mind? A university, classroom, or a bar? At work, even in his work, if his work is dedicated to seeking the truth, or at a lunch counter with a group of guys from the construction site. You can have a place where no one in a certain privileged group will have his feelings hurt, or you can have a chance at a real school or university, but you cannot have both at once. What do you mean by that?
I mean, there it is. What a scandal it is that you would in fact have more liberty to think, to question, to ask, to investigate, to give an opinion, to argue, and not feel in your argument that you were taking your livelihood at risk, right? Putting your livelihood at risk, that you would be more comfortable at a bar doing those things than at a university. That is a great a condemnation of the university, and that's absolutely true. Yeah. My own students at Providence College, by no means felt always free to speak an unpopular opinion in a class. I mean, this was especially true of women's studies classes, but it was true in many other classes as well. And even at that, Providence College was a lot healthier than most other places. And so the whole university then comes to a quick and grinding halt. And there's nothing to replace it.
The church has suffered from the decline of true masculinity as well. You explain in the book, Roman Catholics have abundant experience of what happened when girls were permitted to serve at the altar. The boys disappeared. Why? No doubt for a variety of coinciding reasons, most of which the boys themselves would have been hard put to describe. The camaraderie was spoiled. The older boys, instead of being rather like the first mate or the master at arms aboard a ship, instructing the smaller boys in what to do and how to do it, would now stick out and look absurd. Now, Anthony, the debate over female altar servers, that really goes back a long way. What other ways has the church suffered from a lack of authentic manliness?
Boy, I mean, think about the scandal of abuse in the church, overwhelmingly perpetrated by men who, not solely perpetrated, but preponderantly by men who never grew up sexually, who never grew into a healthy manhood, and who saw it in unnatural and kind of arrested development, sexual encounters with young men, with boys, as if they were stuck in a vicious pre-adolescence or adolescence themselves. The loss of this sense of the transcendent in liturgy. And I sometimes try to ask people to think about a secular ritual that immediately strikes everyone with a kind of awe and may even move someone to tears. That is, if you go to Arlington National Cemetery to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and you watch the men there marching back and forth, they do not look to one side or the other. They do not chat. They don't whisper. They don't smile. They do what they do with absolute silence and solemnity, okay? Because they are there to protect that tomb. That's quintessentially a masculine kind of thing that they're doing. And to the extent that our own liturgies never do something like that. Now, I don't mean they have always to do something like that, but they never do anything like that. To that extent, they, frankly, they simply lose the interest of boys and men. And again, the boys and men themselves would be hard put to describe what's going on. They wouldn't say, oh, I can't stand that anymore because it's all feminine. They wouldn't have put it that way. But it's not as if they would be rejecting anything. It's just that they've never been inspired by it in the first place.
Well, we hear a lot about representation, female representation, this group or that group's representation. There's very little male representation any longer, even in some churches. And that does repel or drive men away naturally because they feel they're encroaching on something that is other and that, frankly, they and their sex are not a part of. I mean, that is part of the, I think, just a natural reaction among guys.
Yeah, frankly, that they're not even terribly welcome. If people blanch at this, I ask them, just be patient with me, be kind to men and boys, and think that in each sex, and in humanity in general, every strength is also sometimes a weakness. A strength in one area suggests maybe a shortcoming too, right? The fact that women are special in some sense, right? They are not the generic human being. They are a special kind of human being. That's to exalt women in one way, but it's in another way, it makes it quite impossible in any culture, quite unthinkable, to give boys girls' names. But the reverse is not true, right? A name can go from being a boy's name to being a girl's name. The reverse does not happen. An article of clothing which has begun to be worn by boys, can then be worn with adaptations by girls or with no adaptations. But the converse is not true. To the extent that something is perceived as essentially feminine, to that same extent, feminists themselves would not impose it upon their own sons. No feminist would name her own son Susie. It's not happening, right? But she might very well name her daughter Madison or other names that were male names, right? So in the liturgy, if you were going to stock the life of the church with what looks like and sounds like Susie, Sally, Mary, I don't mean Mary the Blessed Mother, but basically things that say subconsciously and then sometimes consciously, this is feminine. To that same extent, you lose the boys. You never get their interest. You lose the men. And in the next generation, you lose the women too.
Yeah. Anthony, in a recent survey by the National Center for Health Statistics, the marriage rate fell in the U.S. in 2020 to a 50-year low, down nearly 17% since only 2019. 2020 also had the lowest fertility rate, the number of babies born, since the 1930s. What do those statistics say to you vis-a-vis manliness?
Well, says to me that we are not accomplishing the fundamental work of any society, any culture, right? The fundamental work of any culture is to bring the men and women, boys and girls who become men and women together, right, in strong and stable marriage bonds, family bonds, that will then be rich in children. That's the fundamental work. It's both biological and cultural. It's anthropological, right? Before we even get to theology, it's what every society has to do, or the society dies, right? And if we're not doing that.
I only have a minute left. Father's Day is next month. What would be your message to fathers this year? And what do you want readers to take away from No Apologies, your book?
I want fathers to get themselves into church. I want fathers and mothers to get their boys and girls married. And I want everybody to read the book, No Apologies, so that they can blast out of the water all the lies that they've been told about their own sex and have a proper esteem for it once again.
Anthony, thanks for being here. No Apologies, Why Civilization Depends on the Strength of Men by Anthony ESOLEN is available on Tuesday, May 24th, online at bookstores everywhere, as well as EWTN's religious catalog. Anthony, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Raymond.
That is all the time we have for now. Be sure to catch us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thanks for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo. Bye now.